Get out. Hello, good morning. Glad to have you here. I'm gonna give just another minute to let some other people join. How are we? Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Where are you from? What you working on? I think that there's some other people that are working their way in. I am Lauren. It's great to meet you. Hey, Donna. Hey there. How are we?
Hi. For some reason, my name comes up wrong all the time.
That's okay. No worries. I'm just going to have you keep your microphone on mute because I am recording this for other people. So no worries. You're Allie, right? There you go. No worries. Good, good, good. Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. Just going to give people another minute to join. Feel free to throw where you're from in the chat. I always love hearing where people are from. I am in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I've been loving it here. And yeah, where are you guys from? Where are you in the US? Feel free to throw it in the chat. All right. Well, I am Virginia. Love Virginia. Virginia's not too far from me. I recently went to Richmond and totally loved it. So I don't know where in Virginia you are, Allie, but I personally love it. Well, I just did a last call for everyone. So I am going to, from Salt Lake, Ontario. Yes, I love Ontario. I think it's, honestly, I've never been, but like I've seen pictures, and every time I see pictures of like Canada, I'm like, it's so beautiful there. It always looks so like serene and beautiful and clean. And yeah, I'm from New York, and trust me, it was not always like that. Actually, more often than not, New York was not like that. But it's good to be here in North Carolina. I'm actually getting ready to move soon. So I'm getting ready to move to Texas. I cannot wait. All right, I'm gonna throw my presentation up, and yeah, we are gonna get this bad boy rolling. Okay, so I would have loved to hear, I know you guys already threw some stuff in the chat, but Shakia, you definitely need to move here. What kind of stories are you all working on? Like, what genre are you guys in? I would just like love to hear what you guys are currently writing, what genre you all are writing in. Because genre is important. I think so many of us like underestimate the genre that we're writing in, and how we can use that genre to really like help us enhance our story. Man's back there. Yeah, I'm just curious. I write a little bit of everything. I've written memoirs, I'll get into all that, but I've written like romance, fantasy. Hey, Ian, by the way, glad to have you here. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen so we can kind of just like, yes, okay, romantic, suspense, so romance, I love that. Fantasy, mystical, okay, fantasy, romance, y'all are my people, let me tell you. Those are my two favorite genres. I wrote, my first novel was a fantasy novel, like a coming of age novel, and then the stories that I'm working on right now are romance. So yeah, super, super pumped. Very cool, y'all. So I wanted to touch on Okay, how to write unique characters, vivid settings, and exciting external action. Okay, so we mean this no matter what genre we are writing in, whether it's romance, whether it's suspense, horror, fantasy. We really need to have descriptions that draw our reader into our world. Okay. So this topic is so exciting for me because it's something that I feel like people either do really well at or they really struggle with. And I find like the people that maybe struggle with descriptions are people that are really great at writing dialogue. And the people that maybe like struggle writing dialogue are people that do really great job with descriptions. But I think it's all a balance, right? Whenever we're writing in our book, it's always like a balance of how do we take all of these elements and make sure there's not like one that's dominating our story. Okay, so that's really why I wanted to touch on this topic with you all. So today, I just wanted to give you guys a brief rundown. We are going to be just chatting about me, some common pitfalls I see when people are, making descriptions in their writing. And then I want to get into like how we can apply better descriptions to our characters, our setting, our events, and then like how do we do this in a practical way while we are writing, okay? So that's our rundown today. I cannot wait to hear all your big takeaways at the end. But really quickly, I just wanted to introduce myself. I know that I don't know every single person here. And let me just let these people into our session. Beautiful. So I don't know if I know every single person here, but I am Lauren, Lowe, Lore. I get all different kinds of names thrown at me. I answered all of them, but I am a longtime writer. And I started my freelance writing business as a side hustle in 2019. So like obviously right before COVID happened. And then during COVID, so before I started my writing business and my writing side hustle, I actually worked as a counselor. So I worked in schools, I worked with, kids, I worked with adults, I worked with mostly women, adults, but I worked with everybody in like a counseling setting. So I love working one-on-one with people, like so much. So for me, stepping away from counseling and into writing was such a huge transition, but I've been obsessed with it. I've always been obsessed with writing. I've always been obsessed with storytelling and stories. And in the past year of my business, I've ghostwritten and authored over 25 books for like 20 something clients. And I've spanned everything from memoirs to self-help books to fantasy to romance, literally anything in between. Okay. So I have literally had my hand in like all of these different genres and working with these incredible people and really just helping them tell their stories. I was lucky enough to work with an incredible writer on a ghostwriting project who actually, her book landed on an Amazon bestseller list. I have a couple clients who were able to get picked up by small and medium-sized publishers with their stories. So it's been a wild year, everyone. And for me, it's just been about this like journey of taking storytelling and making it more accessible for people, because I found that like when I started my journey, like trying to write and be a good writer, I couldn't find like very succinct, actionable storytelling advice that was really helpful. And I felt like I was piecemealing all this information from all these different places, but none of it was actually making me a better writer. So for me, like now, I'm like, I've had so much experience with all of this writing. I want to help other people be able to tell their stories. So my mission, guys, is make storytelling simple and make creative writing mad fun. Because I feel like the better we get, the more fun writing becomes. So I want to touch on our common pitfalls, okay? So as you know, I've worked with writers, I've like looked at a lot of writing. These are some common pitfalls I see when it comes to writing descriptions, okay? So sometimes we are just far too general, okay? And this is not the worst, right? But like if we're too general, our audience can't really picture what we're describing in their mind. So it's really important that we are specific. And I know that this kind of scares writers sometimes. We think like, oh God, if we're too specific, like we're gonna not appeal to like a certain audience, or they're not gonna like what we're saying. But honestly, like the more specific we can be in our descriptions, the more universal it becomes. And it sounds counterintuitive, But like when we, you know, are reading a story and we see that like, oh, there, this one character, you know, like loves pickles or something random. We're like, oh my God, I love pickles. And all of a sudden we're like relating to this character, right? So the more specific we can be, the more emotion and emotional connection our reader will have with our characters. And this happens for characters, this happens for settings, and it also happens for events. When we're just too general, you know, readers can't really get a sense of what's happening in their head. Too varied. This one kind of mostly strikes me with settings. When we're like describing settings or even sometimes events a little bit, like our descriptions aren't super concise. So the reader's trying to picture like 18 different things happening in their head all at once, and it's too much for them. If our descriptions for setting are all over the place or we're describing like too much, we're just gonna be like, I have no idea what this place is or what it's even about, right? And being unintentional with our description. So this happens for all three, but my biggest takeaway from being like unintentional is like, we're just kind of taking our descriptions and not really like connecting them with our story itself. And then finally, we either have a little too much description or not quite enough. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier. When I have like a lot of writing clients who are really great at descriptions, they'll write like paragraphs and paragraphs of like beautiful literary descriptions. And sometimes it's way, way, way too much. But on the other hand, I also see that I work with some clients who aren't as confident in their descriptions or their descriptive abilities. So they lean kind of away from it too much. Like we get too much dialogue, not enough setting of the scene. So we get all of this information, but not like kind of structured into a place, into a setting, into a person. So these are kind of some of the pitfalls that I've seen and kind of the ones that we are going to address today. I see somebody asked about the presentation, and yeah, I will give you guys a copy of the presentation for sure. So I'm going to make sure that also you'll get a recording of this if you're on my email list. So I'll definitely make sure that everybody knows that you will get a recording of the presentation and the slides if you want them, because I like to study too. All right, so let's dive in to the good, juicy stuff, okay? So writing unique characters, okay? So number one, personification. So this helps me really get into like understanding who my characters are, but this is such a big like portion of being really intentional with our language, okay? And being really intentional with what we're saying in our story, because I think so much of us think that like our story, the words that we're like writing is the art form. But for me, like the art of writing is like how people interpret our story, things that are happening like between the words on the page. So for me, personification really enhances that, okay? So I will like assign each of my characters a spirit animal or a season or a feeling or a place, or even like associate them with a thing, right? And for me, this helps us really define who this character is as well as their mannerisms, okay? So I want to give an example. I was recently reading a dark fantasy called Neon Gods, and I highly recommend if you like dark fantasy. It's a little kinky, but love it. But the story is about Hades and Persephone, and the author does such an incredible job at personifying these two characters. She really writes Hades as dark, as cold, as withdrawn, and she describes him that way. So like whenever he is like moving, he's like sulking or lurking or creeping, or, you know, like even in his communication is icy or withdrawn, right? She's using words to describe this character, and they're all very similar. They all evoke a very similar feeling and a very similar image. And when this happens over the course of a story, like by the end, if we're like, oh, you know, Hades was like shining as brightly as the sun, we're like, wait a second, he is not that person. He's not that character, right? So This really helps us define who our characters are and be really intentional with our language. And on the other side, we have Persephone, and she was described as this like flower, this beam of light, and everything that she did was like glowing or glittering or sparkling or, just warmth. And, she's evoking all of these feelings just by using these words to describe these characters. So again, being super intentional with how we personify these characters. And this also bleeds over into how they communicate, okay? How does this character talk? What is their way of communicating that is maybe different than other characters? We don't have to have a character that curses every single time they open their mouth, right? But we need to sprinkle these things throughout the story so that our characters are really consistent. And it's something that like a reader might not notice, this personification and the communication style, but their brains totally do. It sounds so silly, but like honestly, when we are doing these things on like as a craft, as a storyteller, like most readers aren't going to pick it up and be like, oh yeah, she personified Hades as darkness. They would just be like, oh, this is a great character, you know? So the readers might not like really recognize it, but our brains really do. So an example of how our characters can communicate, I'm a Harry Potter nerd, so HP I have to use. So for example, in Harry Potter, Hermione doesn't really, or Hermione almost always uses, I'm all backed up. Hermione doesn't really use contractions when she speaks. So she'll say do not instead of don't. She'll say, has not instead of hasn't. She does not typically use contractions when she speaks. Ron, however, likes to use British slang. So whenever Ron speaks, he's typically using like mate or throwing in like some British slang words into his conversations. It's different, right? We see that contrast with these characters. And then Harry ends his dialogue with a question a lot. So like he'll say something and then pose a question at the end, kind of like looking for reassurance from either of these two characters. And again, this isn't something that we like outwardly notice all the time throughout the story, but like if you're looking at it or looking for it, you start to notice these things and you're like, oh wow, it does paint a consistent character across the story, which is what we want. And also helps stamp each character as unique, right? And then last but not least, nonverbal communication. I feel like this is something that we just do not use enough when we are writing, right? Our conversations are not all just words, right? We're also talking cadence, body language, tone of voice, right? So nonverbal communication is so huge. So think about that when you're also working on these characters, right? Like when they are, talking, what are other things that they might do? Do they talk with their hands like I do? Because I can't keep my hands still. Do they kind of like shelter themselves off? Are they speaking quietly? Do they always yell? Or when they get excited, do they yell? Right? So these are all things that we can kind of think about as we are developing these characters. I want to pause really quick and see if anybody has questions. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat about your unique characters. I think writing unique characters is one of my favorite things because we will follow a good character anywhere, right? I feel like this is like so important, especially right in the beginning of our story. I will also say that sometimes like our main character, as we start our drafting, right? I felt this way, like that my main character was very flat for the longest time. So like, as I was working on my first draft, I'm like, oh God, like all these other characters are so interesting, but my main character feels like almost cardboard, like he's falling flat a little bit. And I realized that like, I kind of was discovering who this character was like over the draft process. So this isn't something that like you're going to maybe get right off the jump, right? Sometimes like we need to kind of discover who these characters are during our drafting process. And I'll kind of explain that at the end too, but I just wanted that to stay in your mind that like we don't always need to have these perfectly distinguished or unique characters right off the jump. And sometimes we discover who they are as we write. But these are all just really great things to consider. I don't see any chats, any questions, so I'm just going to keep it pushing. If I see a chat pop up, I will totally stop to check it out. So I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen again. Hope this is going well for you guys so far. Okay, next is setting. All right, so setting is something that I see a lot of writers struggle with. And this to me is so important because setting really helps us set up our scene, right? Like we need to put our characters into a setting every single time we start a new scene. Okay, so I want to encourage you all to be super intentional with, of course, with how you are setting up your scenes. Okay, so number one, I have here, set the tone. Okay, and I think it's being really intentional about what we're doing here. So, like in a fantasy, if our characters are going into like a dangerous place, how can we set the tone of the scene so that the reader knows it's dangerous without us telling them that it's dangerous, right? How can we describe this setting so that the reader can understand, like, oh, this is a not safe place for us to be going? And on the other hand, when our characters enter like this amazing place that's beautiful and welcoming, like how can we, on the other hand, make that stand out even more, right? So I included a picture here because I'm like, what is this image like draw up for you? Like this first image right here. I mean, like this image paints a very different picture for me than something like the one next to it, right? Like if it's dark, if it's rainy, if there's puddles on the ground, right? Like this paints a very different image than something that's bright and sunny and clean, right? So I think it's like thinking about those things, like what's happening here in this scene? Is it a positive or a negative scene? And how can I use descriptions that really help paint that picture? Using the weather, using the people that are in this setting. How can we use all of these different devices to enhance and set the tone of our scenes? Okay, next one. Our descriptions for settings need to be clear and crisp, okay? So if we are entering a new town, a new place, right, and we're describing things or people, you know, which description is easier for you to picture in your head, okay? If we describe something as, okay, our character entered this town where some houses were big and some were small. Some had red roofs or purple roofs or black roofs, and some had circle doors or rectangular doors, and some of the lights were on, but others were off. Is that really easy to picture in your head? Versus where we enter a new setting and we say, you know, all of the houses were dark and squat and falling apart. Paint was chipping, you know, hedges were untrimmed, right? Grass grew wildly on all the lawns. That's a lot easier for a reader to picture in their head, right? Than something that's kind of more varied. So sometimes we think that like by varying our settings a lot, we're doing our setting justice. But at the end of the day, the more clear and concise we can kind of set our scene up to be, the better a reader can picture it in their heads. And my last little tip here, use other senses, right? Especially when we're setting a scene. I think it's so great to throw other senses into the mix, okay? It's not only sight. And I see so many writers get tied up in always explaining what the character is seeing, but not using other sensations, right? Physical sensations, like our character might get chills, right? What does this smell like? In this first picture here, like I can smell the rain, right? Or smell the wet earth or damp trees, right? Use those other senses to draw that reader in, okay? And I think that one thing I love to do that I just don't see enough writers doing is using reference images for their settings. And you could do this for characters, you can do this for settings, you can even do this for like external events. I love to have like a library of reference images because like painters use reference images when they paint, right? Like nobody's like painting a bowl of fruit from their memory, right? Like they're looking at a bowl of fruit and then they're like painting it right here as they're looking at it. So I really truly believe that writers need to be doing the same thing, okay? Like we need to use our reference images to help enhance our setting descriptions. It helps us stay on track as we work on them. All right. The last little tip I wanted to say about settings, actually here, is also that like our characters do not exist in a bubble. Okay, so if we are in a setting that's like a public place, like a market or on the street, or what else, you know, whatever else our setting may be, like our characters don't exist in a bubble. So this means that like there should be other people. They need to be like dodging traffic, right? Maybe there's like a loudspeaker overhead that sounds and goes off. All of these details help bring our scene alive. It tells us that it tells the reader too, more importantly, that there's more life happening here than just with our two characters. So it almost kind of brings us into the book a little bit deeper to say like, okay, there's a story that existed here, like beyond, you know, where the book started and finished, but also that like, this is this character's real life. Like they're not alone in this world, that there's people around, there's noises, there's things happening, right? Okay, that's my spiel about settings and enhancing descriptions for settings. What questions do we have? Throw them in the chat for me. Any questions? When it comes to setting the stage or like setting up a scene, I always, especially if we're buying a new place, need to use that reference image. I find that like my descriptions are 1,000 times better when I have a reference image to peek off of. Give you guys another sec if you want to throw anything in the chats. Alrighty, how are we doing on time? We're looking good so far. How much research do I, okay. Question, how much research do I do before setting a scene? So for me, I kind of focus on three things, okay? So like, especially in Allie, I know you're writing like fantasy or magic. I think it's really important when you're writing fantasy specifically because our settings are varied, right? Like in a fantasy book, our settings are so different because our reader can't assume that like all the rules for regular life are the same. So for you specifically, Allie, I'd say like, I think it's great for you to know before going into a scene, like one, what is like the magic that's taking place here? And like, what is making this specific place different than the other places, okay? So like when I was writing my fantasy novel, the like original world was very like, chill, you know, like there was like a market and everyone kind of like was friendly to one another. But the next location that my characters went to was actually like a very dangerous location. They didn't know that prior, but like when I started to like transition them into this place, I'm like, okay, how does this look? How does like a dangerous place look in this world, right? And for me, I was like, okay, I need to kind of understand like, okay, how does this setting different than the last one? And how can I say like make that stand out? You know, how can I make this setting stand out so that it's very different from the previous one? And I'll also kind of do some like setting research, so, like I described with images. I'll pull up a couple different images. I've also drawn maps, Allie, like if I know that like I am taking characters like through a town or like through a castle or a building, sometimes I'll draw maps, right? Or even if we have like characters walking through a market or out on the street, sometimes it helps to just like sketch out like, okay, here's where they start, here's the turns that they're making, and this is where they're ending up, right? So that like as we're writing, we kind of can reference it and know that like, all right, so they get to here and then they like have to turn left, right? And it helps us layer that stuff into our story as well. Cool. Glad that helped, Allie. Super helpful. Yeah, I'm super visual too. And I feel like we all kind of are. Like we can see things in our heads, but sometimes it's less easy to describe them than when we have like a picture sitting in front of us. We're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. All right, y'all. I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to keep the question. Okay, last but not least, all right, how to write exciting events, okay? And this is something that is going to be different depending on your genre, okay? In an action and adventure story, our events are going to be really different than like a romance, okay? So I think it's really important to say like, okay, what events are the most important in this story, okay? And how can I use tension to build up to them? All right. So events are exciting, not just because they're exciting, but because we've built them up to be exciting. I hope that makes sense. So we need to like have our attention and our buildup to the event be just as, if not more exciting than the event itself. So for me, this means that like we need to use our progressive complications, okay? Our scene begins, what's the first little hiccup our character experiences, okay? How does that little hiccup force them to take action that maybe makes something else happen? And we want to use that causality throughout our scene to kind of tumble our character up until we get to the climactic moment of our scene, okay? That is the biggest tension, that is the biggest event of our scene. So we want to make sure that we're not just like jumping right to it. We want to build up to those big moments by having these little smaller kind of complications come before that to like lead us up to it. And I think that really helps make our scenes exciting. So I also think it's really important for our characters to interact with our scene, our setting. Okay. So like if they are fighting, right? In like an adventure story or fantasy story, if two characters are fighting, like fist fighting, an altercation, right? Like they should be using things in the scene. So like grabbing a chair leg or something, or like grabbing a chair leg and using that to hit someone, or like if somebody's using magic and they miss a character, okay, it might hit a wall and that wall crumbles, right? So like we're using things in our setting and we are making the events have an impact on our setting. So like the fight isn't happening and like the building that the fight is in is standing straight up, right? Like there's going to be rubble falling. There's going to be smoke, right? There's going to be noises, right? Maybe like steam hissing, right? So all the things that we talked about before still apply to these events, but I really want you to think about how can I integrate character and scene when we have these big, exciting events. And then finally, don't rush the exciting parts, okay? I see so often, especially when people are writing magic or fantasy, that they tend to rush through like the magic parts. They tend to rush through the stuff that like the reader loves the most, okay? So for me, we need to slow it down a little bit. Build up to that like magic, that tension, right? Tell us what the character is experiencing through this fight, more than just what they're doing, right? Are they in pain? Are they out of breath, right? Is smoke clouding their lungs? Are tears burning their eyes, right? Like what else is happening? How do we slow these moments down so that the reader can experience this event the same way our character is? Okay. And yeah, that's mostly my tips for exciting events. I really think that it comes down to how do we merge character and setting together? How do we use the setting to enhance the events that are happening? Or how can characters use the setting to enhance the events that are happening? Okay. Yeah. Because like even in a romance, if people are arguing, like maybe they're just getting into a verbal fight, right? Like if somebody was walking past a couple arguing, they might like check on the woman, like, is everything okay here, right? Or you know, like people might be giving, you know, a couple fighting weird looks, right? Like these are all things that might happen. So it's like you need to integrate that into the scene in the moment. So how are we doing about events? What questions do we have about writing exciting events? Exciting moments in our story.
What are you doing, boy?
Do you have a template that you use to identify each part, or is it second nature? So, Allie, typically what I do is I'm an outliner, I'm a planner, I'm not that much of a pantser, but I think that even pantsers can utilize like some kind of organization or structure. That's just my thoughts. Not everybody agrees, and that's totally cool. I think everybody should do what works for them. But in my experience with people who are like working on their first draft and might be running into roadblocks, I say like identify the major plot points in your story and work backwards. So like I think everybody should start kind of having a knowledge of their beginning, their middle, and their ending. The beginning is always going to set us up like, okay, what does this character's ordinary world, ordinary life look like? And that's for any genre. Memoirs, romance, fantasy. The first section of our book is always, what does this character's normal life look like? Okay. And then we have a plot point, right? That thrusts our character into whatever adventure or basically thrusts them into our story. Okay. And then through the story, we have our plot points that say, okay, like here's our next big plot point. We have to get our characters here. Let's move backwards from there. And so on and so forth, all the way up to our main point of climax, our story's climax. And we just kind of, I work backwards in chunks. And okay, just starting, let me make sure I address each part. Co-author and storylines. Yeah, so anytime you're working with another person, and I ran into this a lot when it came to ghostwriting, it's for me, it's like, okay, if you are co-writing, like you guys need to agree on the ending. What is it about this ending that needs to be said? Okay, in a romance, our main endings or our themes are typically like love conquers all, right? A romance readers need a happily ever after ending. They will get real upset if you call your book a romance and don't give them a happily ever after ending. So that's just one example. Okay, so we know that the ending of a romance should be a happily ever after ending. So that said, like our idea here is that love conquers all. That's the idea of our story. Love conquers all. We have a happily ever after ending. How can we choose scenes that exemplify like love conquers all? Because like we start with these characters who seem like they're at odds, who seem like the relationship's not going to work, right? And then as the story unfolds, we see them get closer together. We see them, you know, flirting with each other. We see their walls coming down and how they can be vulnerable with one another. So all of those things show us that love conquers all. So that when we get to the ending, and that's our main climactic point, all of these other scenes have aided to that theme, that big climax at the end. And I think that when you're in agreement with like what your theme is and what your ending should be, it helps two people kind of decide, okay, these are the events that need to happen throughout our story to get our characters to this point. And I would also say, Allie, focus on causality. If you're struggling with making things mesh, focus on causality. This could be like literally a whole nother masterclass. I might have to teach that. But okay. Yeah, so one thing should be causing the next thing to happen. So like in our scene, so like let's say I'm trying to give a really good example that I can pull off the top of my head. Okay, Alice in Wonderland, right? The very first scene of Alice in Wonderland, she is, you know, in her regular life until she kind of like discovers or chases this rabbit, right? Her chasing the rabbit leads her down the rabbit hole. Going down the rabbit hole leads her into this fantasy world. Okay. When she's in that fantasy world, she's still following that rabbit. So we have like these scenes one after the other that are being caused by her actions. So like she can't make it into the fantasy world if she's not following that first rabbit, right? So like one thing is causing the next thing to happen throughout our entire story. We don't want things to be coincidence. Readers don't love that. Publishers don't love that. We need things to cause one another. We need to have our story set up so that if any of the events were changed, the outcome would not be the same. I hope that makes sense. And then for me, guys, like I kind of said at the beginning, applying this to our stories is a little bit more than just like getting this all done at one time and nailing it the first time. Okay. So like I say all of this to say that, you know, like when we are writing our first draft, we might not hit all of this on the head right away. You're probably not. I didn't, for sure. So it's like, okay, knowing this stuff Then we go back in our second draft and say like, okay, where is description lacking? Where can I increase it a little bit more, make things more clear, really hit on the emotional tone of whatever scene I'm in. So it's always going back and layering it, right? If we see too much dialogue, where can we add description? If we see too much dialogue, where can we add events or movement or external action? We're writing and we say, okay, you know, how do we describe our characters? How do we describe really great characters? Focus on what makes them unique, right? And use descriptions that speak to who this character is. So I hope that that makes sense, because for me, it's like, okay, we definitely need to make sure that like we're not just describing characters as like, oh, they're beautiful. Like we are also saying like, no, our character is, you know, in fine silks, right? And of the nicest clothes. Like that tells us more about who our character is than just like they were really rich and they dressed really nice, right? We want to be showing people, not necessarily telling them. Okay. So that's my tips, everyone. I see we have 2 more chats. Okay, in my whip. Oh, I don't want to miss anything. Hold on. Difficult to write scenes where things are happening at once or things happening very quickly. Yeah, totally. When we have a lot of